Hi, Jagosh. What camera are you using?
It's a Kai Riser Pro.
Oh, wait. I don't know, my headphones aren't working.
Works quite well.
That's better. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. That's better. I can hear you now. The reason I asked about your camera, Jagosh, is when you turned it on, it looked like there was kind of like a RGB vibe going on there, like something more fancy than a normal webcam.
Yeah, it's an external camera. It works
Okay.
quite well. It's Kai Riser Pro, and that's the reason why it's sometimes like this RGB thing visible.
Yeah.
My
Looked like a
Linux,
test pattern.
yeah, it's my Linux integration that is probably not very solid, but it works.
Cool.
Definitely better than a built-in camera in most of the laptops,
Have I told you about my new M1?
except of M1 perhaps.
The Pro or the regular M1? Aren't there two M1s?
Yeah, I got the Pro, but the camera's better than the old ones. That was sort of the point.
That's the impact feature, the killer app.
Yeah.
The
It's not 480p anymore in 2022.
Yeah, amazingly.
I got one thing to add at the top here. Just FYI to you, Eric, we completed that evaluation of the engineering allocations in this spreadsheet. It's in the previous agenda notes, but I'll link it here as well. And then from last week, I took the action to add the AppSec reviews as a column as well. And I was kind of surprised there were only a couple that went through AppSec review, including like the more like security focused ones, like the credential stuffing and the visa pre-authorizations and the consolidation of groups and projects into workspaces.
What is PRR?
Production readiness review.
Production readiness review. Okay, that's infrastructures. Okay, so is it fair to say, looking? So thanks for doing this, Way. This is awesome. Is it fair to say, like, as a heat map, aside from the white squares, which looks like they're intentionally not filled in because they wouldn't apply, that we would hope that this whole thing would be green, and that if so, making this process, what we're doing in this working group, should help achieve totally green heat map in the future for stuff like this. Is that sort of the summary?
I think so, because I think we've only included initiatives in here that were relatively large in scope, large enough to where you'd expect all of those processes to have been completed.
Possibly
yeah,
not
so
linear
the
namespace queries, but that's kind of on the cusp. But most of them, yeah.
Agreed. And the white squares, I was just trying to give the benefit of the doubt, like on the rate limiting one, this is still like the blueprint itself is still work in progress. So obviously PRR and AppSec review wouldn't have been completed yet.
Yes, I would say like this is an empirical way to get on the same page about the problem statement. That's what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. And I was on vacation last week, so maybe this conversation happened. But like, we should. I'd propose we start by like making updating the exit criteria of this working group to include, but not necessarily be only this, just designing a process that makes sure all of these things happen when necessary for these types of projects. And that's a noble and I think needed goal for sure. Agreed.
Yeah, and I still I was out a bit as well last week, but I need to get back to that MR and refactor the exit criteria into problems, or the problem statements section into actual problem statements. But yeah, I think this is good data to back it up.
And I don't know if I said that clumsily or not, but I meant like this doing what I just said should definitely be part of the exit criteria of this working group. There can be other things that are exit criteria. So I'm not saying only this, but like this plus whatever else we determine as well.
Right. Yeah. Namely, I think hooking into the next prioritization or some way to get this stuff on products roadmap.
Yeah, for sure.
And I had a Fabian just happened to be in town all the way from Germany, so I got to meet him for lunch on Friday, and we had a good offline conversation around this stuff. He attended the last working group session, and I think he was a bit confused as to like product's role in it. And I tried to explain to him that like we're we're not looking to like necessarily influence the product process at all initially, but we are attempting to define some process that may be helpful for product to adopt in the future if it goes well within engineering, and that seemed to click for him a little bit better because there's all sorts of documentation that they produce related to like investment cases and potentially some stuff that like may not be able to be as public as a blueprint. But I think he was on board with the idea of tying all this stuff to a singular document, right? So if it can't, even if the investment case stuff can't be included in the blueprint initially, um, we would follow a similar process and link it to the blueprint, and then maybe once that feature has shipped, we can go back and make the investment case stuff public and merge it into the same blueprint as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think like business value is business value, so we don't need two separate artifacts to describe that sort of stuff. And product needs their own kind of understanding of it. So whether they derive insights from their market analysis or from customer conversations, or whether we derive it from our technical instincts, it should work towards the same type of form, so everybody understands it like an interface.
Yeah, exactly. That was the part that resonated with him in particular, was that like engineering's producing data that's valuable for products interpretation of the feature or change, right? And likewise, products doing the same thing, but because we're not documenting them in the same place or in the same format or converging around the same general structures, that information sometimes gets lost or sort of telephoned. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing we should be aware of is like as we're working through like and just for clarification, is like the next prioritization working group, that's a purposely generic name because one of the outputs was pick the name for the process. So the process was named, that's going to be cross-functional prioritization, but next prioritization is just the name of a temporary working group. But one of the things we're working on for the new cross-functional prioritization process is there are things that, and I think this work is included in what I'm talking about here, individual PMs, when they're working on their area of the product, it's hard for them to sort of see and understand the value of a project that touches like 6 or 7 groups, right? Because they're purposely in their silo, as are engineering managers to a large extent as well. And so we need to make sure we're covering things from a higher level. Like when we've done stuff in the past, like functional decomposition of CI, or even just like removing sub-transactions from the code base, how can we help to make sure a PM is kind of local to their area and is just focused on like user adoption or driving revenue or certain types of features that are really important to the mission of that group? How can they understand the relative importance of like, well, we need you to spend 20% of your bandwidth for 2 milestones removing sub-transaction queries? Like it's not a sexy sort of thing, but they do have to happen for reasons that I think we all take for granted. But we have to make sure we don't take these things for granted, that we have that way to kind of make sure everybody's kind of doing their part for broad cross-functional stuff, and then still has the bandwidth to do their highly functional, very narrow sort of local stuff.
Yeah, and I think like having a mechanism where there's some overlap between those two things might also be valuable, because I think there's many cases where like an effort starts off being purely functional, right? But when you float that proposal out, or as you work through the implementation, you realize that it can be connected to these other pieces, and that like that may not happen naturally unless like everybody's using the same process and everybody has the opportunity to like see those initiatives taking place and be like, oh, I can hook in here. We're already building this thing. Maybe we should build like the same or build on top of the same underlying solution.
Yeah, and I think like we've done this in the past under duress for emergency items. So like the examples I have are like systems on fire, remove sub-transactions. Like that's very hard to argue with. What we're hoping to be able to do with this process is like the types of things that Jegor and yourself have proposed that are a little bit more kind of strategic and forward-looking and about maintaining the code base and stuff like that. Much harder to make the argument when there isn't a fire to put out for those types of things. So need to make sure it works for those kind of like long-term architectural, almost like preventative measures as opposed to reactive measures to problems. And then one quick question on this list I put together. There's blueprint, production readiness review, AppSec review, and then there's one called done. Does it mean the project, whether it was done or not? So I can remove that one here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then compliant means like compliance review.
Compliant is just like a sort of subjective, like, do we think that this initiative is compliant based on our current documentation of when an AppSec review and PRR and blueprint is required?
Okay, so done and compliant are kind of like meta. They're kind of separate from the heat map. That's our own analysis of it. Okay, all right. So it's really these three things. It's a blueprint, production readiness review, and AppSec review.
That's right.
Okay, glad I asked because never done the three things. Cool. Well, we can move on from this one if the action is clear.
Cool. Yeah, I'm interested to hear from Natalia on the RFC process and specifically like what the typical outcomes are. And I'm wondering like when the work gets fanned out, is that usually like one EM within one team doing like the initial implementation, or have you guys had success with organizing like more cross-team efforts through this process?
Yep, thank you for asking. So normally RFC is something that frontend uses instead of blueprints, because I cannot remember on top of my mind any blueprint that provided from the frontend team. And it's a bit different from the blueprint because RFC is request for comments, while blueprint is a formalized decision and plan of implementation. RFC is just an idea. But it comes with a few important things. It started in 2019. It started by me, by the way. I just joined and I was not sure what we're using for state management. And it came with the three main points for RFC, which would be pros, cons, and proof of concept. So there should be a project that implements it. For frontend, it's easier to write down the implementation. So we made it a requirement. RFC normally involves the discussion. That's why it's request for comments. So you write down your RFC, the proof of concept, you request your fellow colleagues to leave some comments on the implementation. And if we achieve the consensus, it happens sometimes, we just label it as will implement and proceed. If we don't achieve the consensus, sometimes we just ask EMs to join, because normally the discussion goes between individual contributors without involving engineering managers at all. Now, the outcomes. Normally, EMs are not involved in the implementation phase as well. The DRI is the individual contributor that opens the RFC. This brings us the skin in the game concept. So people won't open the RFC if they don't plan to implement, which happened sometimes in the past, so we added this. And then this individual contributor can involve engineering managers or cannot. It depends on the scale of the RFC. If it's relatively small, so we had an RFC for, adding state machines to the front end, the IC just implemented the first and the only finite state machine himself. If it's a big scale RFC, so there is an RFC for TypeScript, for example. So if we come to the conclusion of adding the TypeScript, this would involve not only EM, but I think it will be some kind of development-wide OKR.
So has there been an example? I guess the one you linked is pretty good, but an example of a large scale RFC that did require fan out across multiple teams that was successfully implemented?
I think I don't remember if we added Apollo migration to RFCs. It wasn't discussed in the RFC itself, but it was promoted to development-wide OKR, and I was organizing it, being in all the teams. Basically, all the teams were involved on the check-in phase, especially because we needed to ensure that we didn't break anything, and we can't fully rely on our end-to-end tests for this.
That was the migration of what? Sorry.
Apollo client from version 2 to version 3, so major bump.
Lucas, did you want to voice your comment?
Yeah. I guess I'm just curious, what is the minimum scope by which you bother with the RFC process? Like what feature is small enough that it wouldn't involve an RFC and what would?
I think that should be at least medium size feature, and by medium size, I mean it should involve new tool, new concept, new architecture to some extent. So if you just want to implement some component, that's not the point. But if you, for example, want to change our GitLab UI and just remove Bootstrap view from it and just rewrite it to our standalone implementation, that would definitely require an RFC. Something that involves definitely more than one team, more than one stage, probably.
And do you think, like based on your experience with the process, does the threaded discussion within issues work well enough? Like my perspective on trying to like evaluate like RFCs that had been implemented or completed, it was a bit challenging to dig through the closed issues because some RFCs are closed as like a won't implement, and then some are successfully implemented. And I didn't bother to look if there's like labels to indicate that or not. But just at a high level, do you think managing the decisions as artifacts would be preferable, or is this process specific enough to where it's okay to do in issues?
I think if we involve discussion phase, doing it on issues is fine because we have notifications, we have threads, and it's easy to track the points, especially if we create a threads with a title and you can just follow. The thing we're missing here, I think it was discussed on the previous meeting that when I wasn't involved, and it was brought by Andrew. We need some kind of a final comment on every RFC, maybe just in the description that shows the example of implementation. So if we need state machine, there should be a link to the implementation in the code base if we implemented it. This is something lacking from the RFCs.
I think my preference would probably be, I think you've got a really good process to start with, but I think like more widely, I think having something that ends in a merge request, that's what we use the production readiness, and that's what we do on dedicated. And there's a whole bunch of them. The thing that's great about it is that at the end of the day, you've got a really clear kind of document without the threads, and if you're time pressed, it's much easier to kind of scan through that, and you can see the changes and you can kind of understand how it evolved over time. That's just my preference, but not disputing that the process that you've got for RFCs that works for you in the front end teams really well.
And I think like Lucas had a good question last week that we didn't get to, but he was talking about like best practices for sort of like socializing blueprints and making sure that there's enough eyes on them to where like good discussion happens and good decisions are made. I assume that you'd have a similar problem with the RFCs. So are there any like tricks to that? Do you have like a Slackbot automation that posts them somewhere or anything?
No, there is no Slackbot automation, but it's a great idea to add, by the way. Thank you. Normally, we vocalize them in the front-end channel on the front-end calls because we have shared front-end calls every single week. So if you create an RFC, it's pretty normal to bring it to the front-end call and advertise it there. And big part of the front-end team is also subscribed to the issues on the RFC's repository. We recommend this to do. That's why it's just a notification about the RFC and you can go and check. But we definitely require better process for advertising it as per blueprints.
I think
Yeah.
that's interesting to point out that there's the front end engineers seem to have a much greater cohesion. Like they have that weekly call and they subscribe. And the back-end engineers do not seem to have that. I think there's like a back-end engineering meeting on the calendar. I showed up once. I don't think anybody ever shows up for it. Maybe they do now. But that's a data point on the ease of which to get pulling and rowing in the same direction.
Is much discussed other than RFCs in that call, or is it pretty much like the primary intent is to highlight RFCs and chat about them?
No, that's not the primary. Front-end call is basically major discussions about front-end, not only RFCs. Sometimes we just bring notification about migrations and everything, or sometimes we just ask for help too, because there are some shared front-end tasks that we want to do as a team, like migrations, for example, just migration or something like that. And there is also a social aspect to these calls. We have themed meetings.
So I have a question about the priorities. So what happens if you have many RFCs with will implement label and like more than engineers available to implement them? How do you know which one is more important, which one to implement?
So normally this decision goes to the DRI, so would be author of the RFC. I don't remember that we had any kind of critical RFCs. I think it's against the nature of the RFC. If we have something that needs to be implemented, we don't discuss it, we implement. RFCs is more of the ideas. For example, TypeScript, right? We can operate on JavaScript just fine. TypeScript is not in the priority list. And RFCs rarely have this priority list in general. It's just, I want to improve something, so I bring it there. We don't have an issue of prioritizing them because they are not super prioritized by default.
Yeah, I just wonder because when you contribute an RFC, you submit this request for comments. It means that the thing you want to discuss might be important, and at the end of the day, you may have like many items, right? And then perhaps you have not seen the situation yet in the front end team, but I think on the backend side or architectural side, it's quite common that there are many important items and it's a difficult choice which one we should start with, and given the constraints and capacity limits.
I understand, but so far we didn't meet this problem because when you create an RFC, you should also be ready to the fact that it can be turned down by the team. Even if you consider it being super important, the team can disagree and stop the process. So again, this is not super priority.
What percentage of these RFCs do you think get executed? Because maybe that's a problem to be solved. Maybe these things, if they are important and they're not getting prioritized, maybe that's part of what this working group could help solve by combining sort of forces or methods.
I think of important ones, not just preferences, we had around 80% implemented already, and the rest of them more of the preference. So frontend is doing pretty good. But again, important sometimes is very subjective term. Back to TypeScript. Some people consider like, I cannot live without this. Some people like, I don't see the benefits of it.
And that's interesting because I think that making it less subjective and more objective is also very important. And this is what we've been struggling with on the architectural side, how to make, for example, CI partitioning more objective. How do we quantify the outcomes, the benefits of that, or like, how to be more objective than subjective in this case.
And that's why we have heated discussions about these topics. I think TS is 4 years old with hundreds of comments.
So have these all been fully scoped to front end, or have any of these had like back end components that require discussion? And if so, like how did that go? How did that involve the other team?
normally we don't involve backend. This is like purely front-end implementations. Even for GraphQL, we only discuss front-end GraphQL part, and it doesn't involve backend. I would be happy, honestly, to involve backend or like having similar kind of process. I've been asking a few backend engineers, do they have an RFC process that we could maybe propose something, but it seems there is nothing like this in place. But I believe front-end team would be happy to share the same repository with backend if we need to discuss something that involves both.
By the way, for some additional context, whenever we work on the blueprint, there's always an RFC phase. When we create a blueprint and there's a merge request open, we facilitate feedback from other engineers, engineering managers, product managers. So there is an RFC phase already in the process of writing a blueprint present.
I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the whether it's a real barrier or an artificial barrier, I think there's still some barrier to entry with the blueprint process, because it's really easy for anybody to go and create a front end RFC issue, right? But our documentation tells you that you need a architecture evolution coach, and you need to formulate things in a Google Doc, and then when it's in a certain state, then we convert it to a merge request. So I think that those are the sort of optimizations that we need to make to have a unified process. We just like, I think in general, we need to have a more iterative philosophy when it comes to blueprints, and just get something out in a markdown file ASAP, and potentially even like merge it in a incomplete state, just so that it continuously represents like the decisions that have been made.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
The reason why
there's like approved blueprints and blueprints for consideration or something like that. I think we could just mark them as such, skip the Google Doc phase. And it sounds like from your description, Natalia, that we don't want to break anything that's broken. It's good that 80% of these are getting done, but there's a lot of overlap here. So I think we should, it's a virtue to, I think, consolidate in this case versus a downside. But go ahead, Jigorsh.
Yeah, the reason why we introduced a Google Doc phase is that we were a bit afraid that we won't be safe according to the safe framework with, making our blueprints like avoiding forward-looking statements or exposing things about the bottlenecks in the application that could be, not safe information to share.
Okay, and so maybe from a security perspective as well, right? So there's forward-looking projects and MNPI, but then there's also like, are we teaching determined knowledgeable attackers how to choke off our system? So yeah, if that's the case, then I think we would tolerate the inefficiency of Google Doc and the MR rather than the simplicity of just MRs but public. So.
Yeah, alternatively, we can have a merge request in a project that is non-public, and then after a proper review, we can actually move it to a public project.
I agree with the overlapping, and I think that we can combine both approach, because RFC lack a lot on implementation phase, as we already mentioned. So maybe we can consider RFC being at step 0 in terms of creating a blueprint. So we have an RFC, we discussed everything, like Jagger said, for backend, and then we still implement the blueprint when everything is discussed. So it's easy to create an RFC and start the process, but if it's confirmed, we can continue with the blueprint.
I think that's a good, we're about to run out of time here, but just in the last couple minutes, it sounds to me that like we need to start defining like what the streamline process looks like. And I think a good starting point is just a template for blueprints. And we need something that accommodates like a wide variety of scales, something all the way down to like a relatively trivial RFC, all the way up to like a major architectural change. And I had started to do this more in the context of like our original SIG proposal. So there's still some terminology in this repo that I linked that's no longer applicable. But I have started to define a template that I think captures all the data that is necessary for PRR and AppSec review to be performed. It's been a couple weeks since I've done anything with this, so I'm going to take another look this week. But any feedback on that would be much appreciated.
Do you have a link to that, Marshall?
Yeah, sorry, it's under 3.
Oh, okay.
I'll move your notes down.
I see now. Thanks.
All right, I'll let everyone go, but I'll work on documenting the discrete actions out of this last call, and see you guys next week.